The prison station hung in the dark, between two dead stars, far from any planet anyone cared about. It had no name that most people used. The guards called it the bucket. The prisoners called it the end. The Coalition's official records listed it as holding Facility 9, Deep Sector 11, but no one who worked there ever called it that. The station was old. The walls were the color of dried rust. The corridors were narrow and always a little too cold, and the lights flickered in the lower levels when they power recycled at night. It smelled of recycled air and something metallic that never quite went away, no matter how many times the ventilation was cleaned. It was not built to be comfortable. It was built to be forgotten. Cal Durham had been inside its walls for 4 months. He was not a big man. He was lean and a little weathered, the kind of person who looked like he had spent more of his life outdoors or in space than inside a building. His hands were calloused from years of work. He had a habit of going quiet when he was thinking, and he thought a lot. He did not look like a man who caused trouble. Most of the time, he did not. He had come to the station on charges that even the officer reading them out loud had seemed a little embarrassed about. Unauthorized operation in contested salvage space, interference with a Coalition survey marker, failure to comply with a retrieval order. None of it was violent. None of it had hurt anyone. He had been working a dead freighter on the edge of a restricted zone when a Coalition patrol had showed up and decided to make an example of someone. That quarter, Cal had accepted it without much of a fight. Fighting the Coalition in court cost more than the salvage was worth. He figured he would serve his time, keep his head down, and get back to work. For 3 months and 3 weeks, that plan had worked fine. The yard was the problem. It was the one place on the station where prisoners from different blocks were allowed to move around in the same space, and it was governed by a set of unwritten rules that everyone was supposed to already know. Cal had learned most of them. He knew which sections of the yard belonged to which groups. He knew not to make eye contact with the large cluster of Breckend near the water dispensers. He knew to eat fast and move away from the tables. What he had not known or had not taken seriously enough was Grath. Grath was a Valoran, one of the wide-shouldered, heavily plated species that the Coalition used as enforcers in several of its outer sectors. In the yard, Grath had arranged a simple system. New prisoners, especially small ones, gave up a portion of their food ration twice a week. It was not complicated. It was not personal. It was just what happened. On the day everything changed, Cal had been sitting with his tray when Grath's shadow fell over him. Grath had reached across and taken the larger portion of Cal's meal without a word, the way someone might take something they had already decided was theirs. Cal had looked at his tray. Then he had looked up at Grath. Then he had said, in a voice that was not loud and not angry, but very flat and very clear, that he would like it back. The yard had gone quiet in the particular way spaces go quiet when something is about to happen. Grath had laughed. It was the kind of laugh that was meant to end things before they started. He had reached for the tray again. What happened next was not pretty, and it was not graceful. Cal was not a fighter, but he had spent years working in tight engine spaces where machinery could crush a limb if you did not move correctly, and he had a very precise understanding of where a body's weak points were. When Grath's manipulator arm swung toward him, Cal had shifted, cut the limb at its joint, and used the angle and Grath's own weight to produce a sharp crack that left Grath on the floor, and Cal standing with a very still expression on his face. The guards had come. The yard had gone back to noise. Grath was taken to medical with a fractured joint. Cal had been taken to Warden Ossel. Ossel was a thuric, a species that looked vaguely like a tall, thin human if you did not look closely, and very little like one if you did. His skin had a faint, iridescent quality, like oil on water, and his eyes were set a little too wide. He ran the station with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago and had never recovered from it. He had looked at Cal across his desk for a long moment. Then he had opened a file on his screen, read something, and closed it again. He told Cal that he was going to Cell Block 0. Cal had heard of Cell Block 0. Everyone on the station had. It was spoken about the way storms were spoken about, as a fact of nature rather than a punishment. There was one cell at the end of the block, and in that cell lived something the guards called Vorkai. No one who had been put in that cell had come out alive. It was not an official execution. The coalition had rules about executions. It was just where problem prisoners went when the warden decided the problem needed to be permanent. Cal had stood in front of Ossel's desk and considered this information. He had asked in the same flat voice he used for most things how big the cell was. Ossel had blinked. It was not the question he had expected. Cal was taken through 3 sets of locked doors down a corridor that got colder as they walked and stopped in front of a heavy door at the very end. Through the small reinforced window in the door there was only dark. The guards did not open the door all the way. They opened it just enough and shoved him through, and then it sealed behind him with a sound like a lock on a vault. The cell was not large, maybe 6 m across. The floor was bare. There was a low platform along one wall. That might have been a sleeping surface at some point, though it did not look like it had been used for sleeping in a long time. And across the cell in the far corner, there was dark. Not the dark of shadow. Something in the dark. Something large and very still, and when Cal's eyes adjusted, he could see 2 faint points of red light low to the ground, the color of coals just before they go out. Cal stood by the door for a moment. He could feel the weight of the thing in the corner. He could feel the size of it, the way you feel the size of something in a small space even before you can fully see it. He looked around the cell. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the walls. Then he walked to the wall to his left, sat down with his back against it, stretched his legs out in front of him, and said to no one in particular and to the dark in the corner all at once that the cell was too small for something that big. He said it the way he might say a fuel coupling was the wrong size for the line it was supposed to fit. Not a complaint, just a fact he had noticed. The red eyes did not move. Cal settled his shoulders against the wall and looked at the ceiling. Down the corridor, through 3 sets of locked doors, Warden Ossel watched the security feed with 4 guards standing behind him. They were waiting. They were always waiting in the early minutes for the sounds that would mean It was over. The feed showed two shapes. One large, one small. Neither moved. One of the guards said it would not take long. Ossel did not answer. He watched the small shape sitting against the wall and the large shape in the corner, both of them still, and he said nothing at all. That the cell had no windows. There was no way to tell what hour it was except by the faint change in the hum of the station systems as the power cycled through its overnight settings. The lights in the corridor outside went to their lowest setting, which meant the thin line of pale light under the cell door dimmed to almost nothing. Cal Durham sat against the wall and let his eyes adjust. The red points of light in the far corner had not moved. The creature had not moved. But Cal could hear it now in the quiet of the cell, a low and steady sound that he had first taken for the station's ventilation. It was not the ventilation. It was coming from the creature. A deep rhythmic sound, almost below hearing, that Cal felt more in his chest than in his ears. He did not try to stand. He did not try to speak yet. He sat and he listened and he watched. After some time, the creature moved. Not toward him. It rose from its position in the corner and began to walk. It moved along the perimeter of the cell close to the walls, its steps heavy enough that Cal could feel them in the floor through the seat of his uniform. It walked the full length of the wall, turned at the corner, walked to the next corner, turned again. A circuit, slow and deliberate. Cal counted the steps. He counted the time between turns. He watched the pattern. It walked the circuit 3 times. Then it stopped in the corner nearest. The door stood for a moment and walked back to the far corner where it had started. It circled once in that smaller space and settled again. Cal had seen this before. Not in a creature. In a cargo loader on a freighter he had worked 7 years ago. The loader had a damaged guidance circuit, and when it could not complete its assigned task, it would move in a fixed loop over and over, not because the loop accomplished anything, but because the system needed to do something with the signal it could not resolve. The engineers called it a stuck cycle. It was what some living things did, too, when there was nowhere to go and nothing to fix, and the pressure inside just kept building with no outlet. Cal thought about that for a while. Then he started talking. He did not talk about anything important. He did not try to explain himself or ask questions or say anything that required an answer. He talked about a job he had done 3 years ago, a salvage run on a bulk freighter that had lost power in a slow drift and been sitting for 6 years before anyone found it. He talked about the state of the engine room when he got there, the way old metal smells different from new metal, the particular kind of silence that a ship has when it has been alone for a long time. His voice was low, not a whisper but quiet, the kind of voice you used in a space where raising it would change something. The creature did not respond. The red eyes watched him from the far corner. Cal kept talking. He talked about the first time he had gone into deep space, the way the dark looked different when there were no nearby stars, how it stopped feeling empty and started feeling like something with weight. He talked about a repair he had once done on a fuel line in a space so tight he had to work entirely by feel because he could not turn his head far enough to see what his hands were doing. He talked about the sound an engine makes when it is running right, a kind of low, even hum that you could feel in the floor and how you learned after a while to hear the difference between that sound and the sound an engine made. When something was wrong, somewhere around the second hour, the creature rose and began its circuit. Again, Cal paused while it walked. He tracked it with his eyes in the dark, without turning his head, watching the red glow move along the walls. It did the same circuit as before. Same pace. Same turns. When it settled again, Cal started talking again. He noticed that the second circuit had been shorter than the first. He did not remark on this out loud. He just noticed it and kept talking. He talked about a woman named Linda who had worked the same salvage route as him. For a couple of years she had moved to inner sector work. She had been the best welder he had ever seen, and she had always brought hot sauce with her on runs because she said the food dispensers on salvage ships produced the most tasteless meals in the known galaxy, and she was correct. He talked about a dog he had owned for a while, a big stupid animal that had no working instincts whatsoever and was afraid of loud sounds, but had been very good at sitting next to you when you were tired. Around the third hour, the creature stopped doing its circuit. It did not lie down. It sat in the far corner and it watched Cal with those two low red points of light and the deep sound in its chest. Continued, but it had changed slightly. It was a little slower, a little less tight. Cal noticed this too. He kept his voice at the same level and his posture the same, and he did not change anything because he understood, in the way that he understood stuck cycles and damaged guidance systems, that what was happening was fragile and that the wrong move would break it. He talked about the station they were on. He said it was cold and it smelled bad, and the food was worse than anything Linda's hot sauce could have fixed. He said the guards were rude except for one of the younger ones who sometimes nodded at him in the corridor, which was more human decency than most of the staff managed. He said that Cell Block Zero had a reputation that he was starting to think was at least partly wrong, though he acknowledged he might be biased because he was sitting in it. The creature made a sound, not a movement. A sound, low and short, somewhere between a breath and something else. Cal could not have said what it meant, but it did not sound like aggression. It sounded like something acknowledging that a sound had been made. Cal said that was fair. He kept talking. The hours moved. His voice got a little rough from the use, but he kept it steady. He talked himself through every significant job he had worked in 15 years of salvage, every long quiet stretch in deep space, every engine he had ever fixed or tried to fix or failed to fix and had to report back on. He talked the way some people would have sat in silence, using it as something to do with his hands. Somewhere in the fifth hour, the creature moved again. Not a circuit this time. It shifted its position. It moved away from the far corner and settled in the middle of its half of the cell, not near Cal, but no longer at the maximum distance either. It arranged itself on the floor the way a large animal arranges itself when it intends to stay in one place for a while. Its head came down. The red eyes did not close, but they lowered slightly. The deep sound in its chest settled into something steadier. Cal let his voice go a little quieter. He was talking about the color of a nebula he had passed through once, the way the light had looked on the hull of His ship, how it had been the kind of thing that made you feel strange and lucky at the same time. By the time the corridor lights shifted back toward their daytime level, the creature was within 3 m of Cal. It had moved slowly over the hours, not in one motion but in small shifts, the way water finds a level. It was not touching him. It was not looking at him with anything that could be read clearly. But it was near him, and its body was angled toward him, and the tight coiled tension that had filled the cell when Cal first came and had gone somewhere. Cal finished his story about the nebula. He sat in the quiet for a moment. Then he said that was probably enough talking for one night. The creature breathed. Cal leaned his head back against the wall, looked at the ceiling, and let the silence sit between them. It was not the silence of two things waiting to see what the other would do. It was just quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when two things have decided, without any formal agreement, that they are all right where they are. Outside the cell, the station woke up. For another day, the junior guard's name was Fun. He was 22 years old, a Harak human hybrid from one of the border colonies, and he had been working the early shift at Holding Facility 9 for 7 months. In those 7 months, he had learned to do his job without looking too hard at the parts of it that made him feel bad. Most of the time that worked fine. On the morning after Cal Durham had been put in cell block 0, Fun was assigned to check the feed and log the result. It was a job that usually took about 30 seconds. You looked at the screen, you confirmed that the cell contained one living occupant instead of 2, you entered it in the log, and you moved on. Fun looked at the screen for a long time. The feed was not great quality. Cell block 0 was old and the cameras had never been upgraded. But the image was clear enough. There was a large shape on the floor of the cell, and beside it, close to it, not touching it but close, there was a smaller shape sitting against the wall, with its legs stretched out, apparently asleep. Fun checked the feed number twice to make sure he was looking at the right cell. He was. He stood there for another moment, then walked quickly to Warden Ossel's office and knocked on the door. Ossel had seen a lot of things in his time running the station. He was not a man who moved fast or spoke loud. He walked to the monitoring room at a normal pace, looked at the feed with his hands folded behind his back, and was quiet for about 20 seconds. Then he said very flatly that this was not possible. Fun said that he had checked the feed number twice. Ossel looked at the screen a little longer. The two shapes had not moved. The large one appeared to be resting. The small one appeared to be asleep. Ossel told Fun to get a removal team to the block. The human was to be taken out and returned to general population. The situation was an inconvenience, but it did not change anything. The prisoner had survived the night, which was annoying, but the paperwork required that he be formally processed and returned to his original cell. The removal team was 4 guards, all of them bigger than Fun, and all of them great deal less interested in thinking carefully about what they were walking into. They went through the 3 sets of locked doors with the particular, purposeful walk of people who expected the situation to be simple. They opened the cell door. Cal was awake. He was sitting up, his back against the wall, watching the door with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite calm, somewhere in between. He started to rise. The creature rose first. It did not lunge. It did not make a sound. It simply stood up, all of its considerable height and width filling the space, and moved to place itself between the guards and Cal. It stood there. It was not threatening in the way the guards recognized as threatening. It was not bearing anything or making noise. It was just standing in the way, very completely, the way a wall stands in the way. The lead guard told it to move. It did not move. The guard stepped to the left to go around it. The creature shifted left. The guard stepped right. The creature shifted right. Every time the guards tried to find an angle, the creature adjusted calmly and without hurry, maintaining its position between them and the human with the quiet certainty of something that had decided this was simply how things were. The guards looked at each other. One of them reached for his control rod, the kind of device designed to deliver a strong enough shock to bring most creatures to their knees. He raised it. Cal said from behind the creature, in a careful and even voice, that he would strongly advise against that. The guard looked past the creature at Cal. Cal said that he did not know a lot about the situation yet, but he was fairly sure that making the creature angry was not going to help anyone. He said this the way he might advise someone not to kick a fuel line they were trying to fix. The guards retreated to the corridor. The door sealed again. Ossel was contacted. He arrived at the monitoring room in the same unhurried walk, looked at the feed, and this time the expression on his face was something less controlled. Not fear, more the look of a man who has found a problem in a place where problems were not supposed to exist. He tried to think of a simple solution. He was still trying to think of one when Lieutenant Petrova walked into the monitoring room. Petrova had been the human liaison officer at the station for 6 years. Her job, in theory, was to ensure that the small number of human prisoners held at the facility received the protections they were entitled to under interstellar compact law. In practice, her job was to file paperwork that no one read and to be present at meetings where her concerns were noted and then ignored. She was a tall woman with short, gray-streaked hair and the kind of tired that had settled so deep it had become just a part of how she held herself. She had received the alert on her communicator and had come to see what it was about. She stood beside Ossel and looked at the feed. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the creature standing in the center of the cell and at Kel, sitting behind it with his back against the wall and at the space between the creature and the door where the guards had been. Then she made a sound. It was short and involuntary, and it took Ossel a moment to recognize it. She was laughing, not mockingly, not at anyone. It was the laugh of someone who has been handed something so unexpected that the only honest response is a kind of helpless amusement. Ossel looked at her with a flat expression and asked if she found the situation funny. She said no. She said she found it remarkable. She said that in 6 years on the station she had watched the coalition staff treat every human prisoner like they were a minor inconvenience with no surprises left in them, and that in one night, without any weapons or plan or backup, one tired engineer had walked into a cell that no one had ever walked out of and had come out in the morning with what appeared to be the only friend that creature had ever had. Ossel said that changed nothing. The prisoner was still a prisoner. Petra said that she understood that. She said she was also filing a formal incident report and a request for a specialist. She said she was filing it right now, before the end of her shift, before anything was moved or changed or decided. Ossel looked at her. She looked back at him with the particular calm of someone who has stopped asking for things and started documenting them instead. Ossel said she could file whatever she liked. Petra nodded and left the room. In the cell on the feed, the creature had not moved from its position between the door and the human. It stood exactly where it had stood when the guards had left. It showed no sign of moving. Kell, behind it, had leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, apparently not concerned. Ossel looked at the feed for another moment. Then he went to his office and spent a long time staring at a report he was not sure how to write. Dr. Niren Cole arrived at the station 2 days after Petra Vass filed her request. He came on a small transport that smelled of old coffee and recycled air. And he had 3 bags with him, 2 of which were full of data equipment. He was a compact man in his early 50s. With reading glasses he pushed up on his head when he was thinking and kept there until he needed them again, which meant they were always getting lost. He had been studying Vorkai for 4 years, not in person, from a distance through observation logs and the occasional blurry camera feed. The coalition had classified Vorkai as a sapient but prelinguistic entity, which was a formal way of saying they had decided he could not communicate in any way worth paying attention to and had moved on. Cole had not agreed with that classification. He had spent 4 years building a quiet argument against it from the observation data, but no one had been particularly interested in his argument until Petra Vass had sent 3 paragraphs describing what had happened in cell Block 0. Cole reviewed the observation logs for 6 hours before he spoke to anyone. Then he asked to speak to Kell. They sat on opposite sides of the cell door, Kell on the floor on the inside and Cole on a small stool in the corridor. The creature Vorkai was visible in the background of the cell, not at the door, but not far from Kell either, positioned in the middle of the space in the same way it had been positioned since the morning after Kell arrived. Cole had a recorder running and a notebook open on his knee. He asked Kell to tell him everything that had happened from the moment he entered the cell. Kell told him he was not a man who decorated his sentences. He described events in the same order they had happened in plain words, without trying to make them sound like more than they were. He said he had sat down because standing seemed like the wrong choice. He said he had started talking because the silence was too heavy and he did not know what else to do with it. He said he had noticed the creature's pacing and that it had reminded him of a damaged loader he had worked on once. He used the word stuck cycle without explaining them and then explained them. When Cole asked, Cole wrote for a long time after Kell stopped talking. Then he went to find Petra. They sat in her small office, which was crowded with filing cabinets and had one narrow window that looked out at the underside of the station's external docking arm. Cole put his notebook on the desk and pushed his glasses up onto his head and said he needed to explain some things. Petra said she was listening. Cole told her about Vorkai's species. They came from a moon that orbited a gas giant in a system that had been cataloged but never settled, far outside the usual coalition lanes. The moon was dense and dark, and the creatures that lived on it had evolved in conditions where visibility was low and sound carried poorly. Their primary language was not sound, and it was not gesture in any way the coalition's translators could recognize. It was behavioral. Specifically, it was based on a system of proximity, posture, and what Cole called long cycle presence, meaning the meaning of a communication was not in a single moment but in a pattern of behavior sustained over a long period of time. Petra asked him to say that in simpler terms. Cole said that the way Vorkai species talked to each other was not by making a sound or a sign at a specific moment. It was by how they moved and where they stayed over the course of hours. A threat was not a raised limb. A threat was a specific pattern of movement sustained for a specific amount of time. A greeting was not a gesture. It was a sequence of postures and distances maintained through a long encounter. To communicate anything, you had to stay in it. You had to be consistent, and you had to know the patterns which no one had ever taken the time to learn, because the coalition had classified the species as prelinguistic, and that had been the end of the conversation. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she asked what Kel had done. Cole said that was the part that had kept him up the previous night. He said that the greeting protocol of Vorkai species, as best as he had been able to reconstruct it from the observation data, involved 3 elements. First, a non-aggressive entry into shared space, meaning you did not approach from above, you did not run. You did not make yourself large. You made yourself small and still. Second, a period of vocalization at a low and consistent register, not communicating content but communicating presence, the equivalent of a signal that said, I am here and I am not a threat. Third, sustained proximity over multiple hours without initiating contact. He said that Kel Doram, an engineer from a salvage background with no training in xenobiology or linguistics or contact protocols, had done all 3 of these things in sequence on his first night in the cell. Petra stared at him. Cole said he was not finished. He said that what Vorkai had done in response was also entirely legible once you understood the language. The movement toward Kel over the course of the night was not predatory drift. It was a response greeting. The positioning in the morning between Kel and the guards was a specific posture in Vorkai's behavioral vocabulary that translated as closely as Cole could render it in common speech to something like this one is. With me. He opened his notebook to a page with a single phrase written at the top and underlined twice. The phrase was Denkin. Cole said it was the closest word he had for the concept. It meant something between bonded companion and trusted sheltermate. It was not a casual association. In the behavioral language of Vorkai's species, it was about as serious a declaration as you could make. Petra sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. She asked how Kel had known to do any of it. Cole said that was the thing. Kel had not known. He had not done any of it on purpose. He had sat down because standing seemed wrong. He had talked because silence was too heavy. He had kept his voice low because raising it felt like the wrong choice in a small dark space. Every decision he had made that night had been the right decision by complete accident, and the reason it had been an accident was that Kel Durham had walked into a cell expecting to share it with something that was suffering and had responded to it the way humans responded to suffering, by trying to make it a little more bearable without overthinking it. Cole said that 11 years of coalition management had produced 11 dead cellmates and 0 communication. 1 human, 1 night, no training, no plan had produced the first successful contact with a species the coalition had written off as unable to communicate. There was a sound from the doorway. Ossel was standing there. Cole had not heard him arrive. Ossel's expression was the expression of a man who had been listening for longer than he intended to. Ossel said that none of this changed the legal status of the prisoner. Cole looked at him. He said that was correct. He also said that what had occurred in Cell Block 0 2 nights ago met the formal definition of first contact under Interstellar Compact Article 31, subsection 4, and that he intended to file it as such, and that the compact's first contact provisions would then require a full review of any outstanding legal proceedings involving the individuals present at first contact, and that this would need to be handled through the compact's offices rather than the stations, and that he was going to need a stable communication line to make several calls. Ossel looked at him for a long moment. Cole looked back. Ossel left without saying anything else. Petra watched him go. Then she looked at Cole and asked if any of that was actually going to work. Cole pushed his glasses back up onto his head. He said he genuinely had no idea. But he said that the creature in Cell Block 0 had just demonstrated in the clearest possible behavioral terms that it was sapient, communicative, and capable of social bonding, and that a human prisoner had been the only being in 11 years to figure that out. He said that was at least worth a few phone calls, but the weeks that followed were not fast or easy. The compact's legal processes moved the way large, heavy things move slowly and with a great deal of noise. Petra filed her reports. Cole made his calls. Ossel filed counter-reports, and the counter-reports were answered, and those answers were answered in turn, and the whole thing ground forward like a machine that was not sure it wanted to work but could not quite stop either. Through all of it, Cal Durham stayed in Cell Block 0. Not because he was required to. No one had formally extended his stay. It was simply that every time the subject of moving him came up, Vorkai made it very clear that the answer was no, and no one on the station staff wanted to test what came after no. Even Ossel had stopped pushing it. There was a memo circulating among the guards that described Vorkai as an unpredictable security risk and recommended that Cell Block 0 not be approached without senior authorization, which was a formal way of saying that the creature had won the argument without ever saying a word. Cal did not mind. He had not expected to feel that way. He had expected the cell to feel like a cell, and in some ways it still did. The cold floor, the thin light, the meals that arrived through a slot in the door. But there was something else in it now that had not been there before, a kind of company, the particular quality that space had when you were not alone in it. He and Vorkai had developed a routine, not a formal one, not one that either of them had decided on. It had just grown the way routines grow when two beings spend enough time in the same space. Cal talked in the mornings when he woke up, usually about whatever had been in his head when he was sleeping. Vorkai moved through his circuits in the early part of the day, and Cal had learned to read the length and pace of the circuits the way you learn to read an engine's rhythms, knowing which sounds meant something needed attention, and which sounds were just the ordinary sounds of a thing working. Cal visited every day. He sat outside the door and recorded and asked questions and sometimes just watched. His notebook had grown thick. He was learning slowly to read some of what Vorkai communicated, and he shared what he found with Cal, and Cal listened, and then went back to watching, and slowly, the way you learn the feel of a new tool. Before you learned its name, he began to understand a little more of what Vorkai was saying. Not in words. Vorkai did not use words, but a shift in posture, the angle of the head, the way the weight was distributed, the particular quality of the low sound in the chest. These things meant things, and Cal had spent 15 years learning to pay attention to things that meant things without announcing themselves. One afternoon, Cole told Cal that the word Vorkai used for him in the behavioral vocabulary they were slowly building a translation for was the same root word as the one that meant reliable. Heat source. Cal had thought about that for a while. Then he had said that was probably the nicest thing anyone had called him. The legal review moved forward in pieces. The first contact filing went through 3 levels of compact bureaucracy before it reached an office that had the authority to do something with it. At each level there was resistance, and at each level Cole had submitted more data and Petra had submitted more documentation, and the resistance had slowly worn down under the weight of it. Ossel made one significant attempt to stop it. He submitted a request for Vorkai to be reclassified as non-sapient on the grounds that the behavioral communication system Cole had identified did not meet the compact's technical definition of language. He submitted this with a supporting document from a coalition linguist who had never met Vorkai and had read Cole's preliminary findings for approximately 2 hours before issuing an opinion. Cole's response to this was filed within 36 hours. It was 47 pages long and cited 112 sources and dismantled the coalition linguist's opinion with the calm, thorough precision of a man who had spent 4 years building this argument and was not remotely interested in being patient about it anymore. Petra read the whole thing and told Cole it was the best thing she had read in 6 years on the station. Cole said he had been saving most of it. The reclassification request was denied. The review came through on a Tuesday morning station time. Cal was told through the slot in the door that his sentence was provisionally suspended pending a full compact review of the circumstances of his imprisonment and the events of his time at the facility. He was to be moved to temporary quarters while the review proceeded. His safety was to be guaranteed by compact authority, which meant Ossel could not do anything about it. Cal sat with that information for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the center of the cell. He had been practicing something for the past 2 weeks. Practicing was not quite the right word. He had been paying attention, and he had been trying, and he had made mistakes. And Cole had corrected him, and he had tried again. It was the leave-taking gesture of Vorkai's species, or at least his best approximation of it. It involved a specific posture and a specific distance and a specific quality of stillness sustained for a specific amount of time, and getting all three right at once was genuinely difficult, especially since he did not have the right kind of body for most of it. Vorkai watched him. Cal settled into the posture as well as he could manage. He held it for the right amount of time. He held the distance. He kept the stillness. It was imperfect. He knew it was imperfect. He had the rough shape of the thing, but not the detail, the way a person who had learned a few words of a language could say something recognizable without saying it quite right. Vorkai was still for a long moment. Then Vorkai made a sound. It was not one of the usual sounds. It was shorter and lighter, and it had a quality to it that Cal could not name precisely, but that sat in his chest a particular way, warm and slightly aching at the same time. Cole, who was in the corridor with his recorder running, would write in his notes that evening that the sound Vorkai made in response to Cal's leave-taking was one he had only found in the behavioral records twice before, both times in historical documentation of Vorkai's species in their home environment. He would write that the closest translation he could manage was something like, "You are strange and you tried, and that is enough." Cal walked to the door. He paused for a moment with his hand near the door and looked back. Vorkai had not moved from the center of the cell. The red eyes were steady. The low sound in his chest was the slowest and evenest it had ever been. Cal went out into the corridor. Petra was waiting there, along with two compact officers who had come to escort Cal to his temporary quarters. She looked at Cal for a moment with the expression of someone who had been holding something tight for a long time and had just been told they could put it down. She did not say anything right away. She looked past Cal through the small window in the cell door. Vorkai had walked to the far side of the cell. He circled twice in the old pacing pattern, the one he had done every night for 11 years before Cal arrived. But then he stopped. He turned. He settled himself on the floor, facing the door, and he waited. Petra watched him for a long moment. The compact officers were quiet. Even the two guards who had come to seal the door behind Cal were quiet. Petra had spent 6 years on the station, arguing that human beings deserved to be treated as something more than a footnote in the coalition's record keeping. She had spent 6 years being told that humans were simple and loud and not particularly interesting, that they were a minor species in the outer sectors, and the coalition had bigger concerns. She had filed reports and attended meetings and been ignored in rooms full of beings who had decided before she opened her mouth that she had nothing to say worth hearing. She watched the creature on the feed. She watched him sit in the cell and face the door and wait for something, and she understood in a way she did not have words for in that moment what she was looking at. She was looking at the result of what happened when a human being with no plan and no training and nothing to offer except patience and the inability to be unkind to something that was hurting, walked into the darkest room in the station and just stayed. She was looking at 11 years of loneliness ending in a single night. She was looking at something that every advanced civilization in this part of the galaxy had failed to do, and that one tired engineer had done without trying, simply because he was human, and because being human meant that when you Found yourself in the dark next to something suffering. Your first instinct was not to run and not to fight, but to sit down and start talking. She did not say any of this out loud. She just stood in the corridor and let herself feel it, all of it, the relief and the exhaustion and the particular sharp thing that was not quite pride and not quite grief and did not have a proper name. Behind the sealed door, in the cold and quiet of the cell, the beast waited for his human to come back.